of this stuff.
Other than that, I have plenty of time to get it. Next year's the last.
Oh, I didn't know that. So you have to get another.
I can do like the thing that I have to clean up.
Yes, yes.
Left over. I can get
How many years?
well, I mean, it definitely it's up to discretion. But the last official year is next year. So I can have a lot of work time for us. And, I have to find a lot of new crew members because so many students are even Rob was keen to come back to the UK schedule now, so anyway, he wants to work on Crete too. It doesn't include working beside his he must still work on it. He's interested in vanilla. Yeah. That was his proposal to the bill. It was all about looking at Minoan spaces, props, the actors, spaces.
Yeah, see, I thought I remember this.
I threw a bunch of theory at him that way. He texted me yesterday.
Now, my children read German message. Right, sure.
I'm doing Italian next week back to okay, all of the material from justice is based on the
Something is Italian demise just with the Latin.
Of course, I'm telling you, if you have Spanish, you tell you the place first.
That's why Germany's the necessary. And the others not significant. Then Greek would be the second. Right?
Basic up like straight, but I'm like,
Because that's going to be his focus.
and also, well, and that's just true. It will help him speaking, but there is an awful lot of academic parasitation, if you will, literature. This was produced by professional students, for example, that he should be able to
Yeah.
All right, everybody, let's get started. Thank you very much. I welcome all of you, and it's so great to see all your bright, shining faces in the audience here at the 2025 Ancient Studies Week keynote lecture given by Dr. Debby Sneed, whom I'm going to be, I left my intro. It's sort of brief. I'll be introducing to you right now. I hope that's not too loud, is it? Is it, what? It's good? Good. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Debby Sneed, Assistant Professor of Classics at Long Beach State University to the UMBC campus as the 2025 Ancient Studies Week keynote speaker. Dr. Sneed received a BA in English and History and a master's degree in Classics from the University of Colorado. Her BA was from Wyoming. And a PhD in Archaeology from UCLA in 2018. Dr. Sneed also serves as field supervisor of the Agora excavations and summer program in Athens, both overseen by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. In recent years, Dr. Sneed has established herself as one of the most original and clear-toned voices, not only as a scholar in the field of disability studies, but also as an advocate for the accommodation of disabled individuals in the often grueling work of archaeology. Dr. Sneed's career has been ascendant since her first publication, a study of accessibility in ancient Greek healing sanctuaries through the use of ramps. This paper won the 2021 Ben Cullen Prize in Archaeology. Her next publication tackled the problem of infanticide and disability in ancient Greece. It's a very difficult problem because these sources are so bad. Before she published a groundbreaking analysis of ancient Greek and Roman crypt-lit. Now, I assume you all know what crypt-lit is. I had no idea, so I thank you very much, Debbie, for introducing me to crypt-lit. Dr. Sneed's most recent works explore the aesthetics of disability. Today's talk, Disability and the Ideal in Archaic Greek Art, in which archaic, because everything about Greek art is archaic, right? I mean, but this is specifically referring to a conventional time period in ancient Greek history that extends from 700 to 400, about 490 BC. Everybody has his or her own idea of when the archaic period was. Dr. Sneed's talk today derives from a paper entitled A Dwarf Maiden on the Athenian Acropolis, Disability and Dedication in the Archaic Polis, to be published in December 2025. In 2026, her article, Beautiful Hephaestus, which of course is an oxymoron, a representation of a Colossus inscription, will appear in the journal Greece and Rome. And I do note that Greece and Rome and some of the other places where Dr. Sneed publishes have very large readerships. I would be remiss if I didn't extend my warmest gratitude on behalf of the Ancient Studies Department to Amy Freud, Courtney Hobson, and Courtney especially for her extraordinary competence and for her unfailing helpfulness. She was instrumental in putting this talk together. The Drescher Center for the Humanities and the Critical Humanities minor, no, the Critical Disability Studies minor for their generous co-sponsorship of this lecture. So without further ado, Dr. Debby Sneed.
Thank you so much for what might be the most generous introduction I've ever received. Thank you so much. I'm a little bit warm. You guys all saw I wore a jacket, right? Okay. Okay. I want to thank David Rosenblum and the entire Ancient Studies department here at UMBC for the invitation to participate in Ancient Studies Week. And thank you also to the Drescher Center for the Humanities and the Critical Disability Studies minor for co-sponsoring this talk. It is a real honor to be here and to see the topic of disability being included in your celebration of the ancient world. In my work, I try to show that disability is not a niche topic. It is something that is relevant to all of our work on the ancient world. And this invitation to speak to you today really validates that mission. So I thank you for the invitation and also to all of you for being here to hear about it. With this project, I worked with Dr. Erin Lawrence Roseman, who just finished her dissertation at UC Berkeley and is a specialist in ancient Greek women's clothing. And I myself work on disability, right? And this project is actually a little bit unusual for me. I don't usually do what you might call retrospective diagnosis in my work, where I try to diagnose specific disabilities in ancient art or literature. But today I will be doing that to a certain extent. And I'll be talking about the Archaic period of Greek history, specifically about one statue that's dated to about 510 BCE. This is around the same time that Athens ejected their tyrant and established the democracy. It's at this time that we start seeing new patterns of dedication in Athens, and we think that maybe with the democracy, more people are able to access the kind of competitive dedicatory spaces in the city. Okay, now ancient Greek art is maybe most famous for its representations of the human body, something we can see in the Archaic period through statues of male and female figures called korē and korē. These statues have been found in cemeteries where they functioned as grave markers, but also in sanctuaries where they were dedicated to a god or goddess as part of a ritual exchange. On the Athenian Acropolis, which was dedicated to the goddess Athena, more than 70 korē, that's the statues of female figures, have been found, along with more than 300 statue bases, many of which likely held additional korē. Now, usually we talk about them all together as this kind of homogenized group of beautiful maidens. You can see just 3 of them on the screen now. Today, I'm going to focus on one of these that I think shows a type of representation that we usually reject as possible for any period of Greek art. That is a realistic representation of a dwarf woman dedicated in a solemn context. This is Acropolis korē 683. Sometimes called the red slippers korē. I won't tell you why. This is an under-life-size statue carved from a single block of marble. It's been dated stylistically to about 510 BCE. The statue was part of a double dedication. I'll return to the second figure and the inscribed base a little bit later in the talk. Now, this korē stands facing forward with her right foot advanced. Her hair, which is capped by that diadem, is thick and intricately textured. She has a fringe of cut hair that frames her face. The crinkly chiton that she wears, that garment she's wearing, is folded over at the waist to form a low pouch that we call a kolpos. The sleeves of her chiton stretch nearly to her wrists. A smooth ribbon, or a band, traces both arms and her neckline. This ribbon is decorated with a lotus and palmette design and small alternating triangles. On her feet, she wears closed-toed shoes that are pointed and upturned at the top of the toe. In her left arm, which is bent up by her side, she holds a pigeon whose head is missing. And in her right hand, which is slightly raised, she holds up a piece of her chiton. Red paint remains vibrant on her shoes, her hair, her lips, and portions of her chiton. Her eyebrows, the rims of her eyelids, and her pupils are painted black, while the irises of her eyes are yellow. Now, on the museum website, this korē is described as having peculiar proportions, with a disproportionately large head, short legs, and long arms. Scholars have attempted to explain some of her physical features in a variety of ways, which I will get to, but I argue that this is just a typical ancient Greek representation of a dwarf. Now, in the modern period, we distinguish between more than 200 different genetic conditions that cause skeletal dysplasia and result in short stature. When scholars of the ancient world attempt to describe images of dwarfs, they usually try to identify the specific type of dwarfism that was represented according to modern diagnostic criteria. But this approach is anachronistic, right? Ancient Greeks didn't distinguish between different types of dwarfism in their writings or their art. Rather than attempting to distinguish particular types of dwarfism, Greek artists conveyed this bodily difference through a variety of features that could include things like short stature relative to other figures in a scene or group, a disproportionately large head, short or long limbs, a short or long torso relative to the total height, and a swayed back. These features could appear in any combination to communicate the idea of dwarfism. Now, in this statue, we can identify several hallmarks of ancient Greek depictions of dwarfism. These features would have been especially obvious to viewers in the ancient world who saw her set up in her original context, alongside dozens of other korē who exhibited more typical proportions. Probably the most striking physical feature of this statue is the size of her head. In this slide, the statues are not to scale. I've adjusted them so that we can pretend that they're all the same height so that you can see how the proportions line up with 2 other complete or nearly complete korē. There's not a canon of proportions for korē like we sometimes talk about for kouroi, for the male figures, but most korē, regardless of scale, have heads that are about 1/6 or less of their total height, while our korē's head is about 1/5 of her height. So it is significantly bigger relative to her height than what we see on other roughly contemporary statues. The size of her head is further emphasized by her bouffant hairstyle, which would have made the contrast with the other korē all the more obvious. Overall, there's an emphasis on things like roundness, projection, and disproportionality in the statue's body. Now, while most other korē are relatively balanced top and bottom, the torso of this korē is actually shorter than her legs. You can see that from the back. But her garment, right, with that low-hanging kolpos, that pouch at the front, makes it appear that the opposite is true, right, from the front. The point here is that it's the impression of disproportionality that's being emphasized. Her breasts are prominent and heavily rounded, as are her shoulders and her upper back. Again, the scale is off here, but I want to show you how the profile of her body differs significantly from other korē. Notice how her shoulders are significantly rounded, which creates this curve to her upper back, which then curves back in on her lower back and out again for her buttocks. Evelyn Harrison was particularly struck by the abrupt way that the buttocks projected from the small of her back. You can also see how her buttocks sit higher on her body than they do on other korē, beneath that deeply swayed back, making that projection even more prominent. The roundness of her body is obvious in her facial features as well. She has protruding eyes, full rounded cheeks, and a prominent cleft chin. Again, her hair swells around her face, adding to that sense of roundness. A scholar named Eleanor Goralnik wanted to see if korē were designed according to a canon of proportions, right? Something that's been proposed for the contemporary statues of male figures. She used statistical modeling to compare the proportions of 26 korē with each other, as well as with modern living women. Okay, the study has some problems, as you can imagine, but what is relevant is that Goralnik showed that 683 was an outlier from the other korē in terms of her proportions. Her body compared in only 5% of the analyses with modern women, while other korē were much closer in bodily proportions, not only to modern women, but also to each other. Goralnik noted our korē's unusually wide hips and big head. One thing that is important to note is that the features of this sculpture that are outliers relative to the other korē are not the result of inattention or a low level of skill by the sculptor. In fact, the sculptor here has paid much more attention to what we might call the realistic features of the human body than we can see reflected in other statues. Her ears and eyes are more detailed than those of other korē. Her nose is prominent, as is her philtrum, which is that concavity between your upper lip and your septum. Her labiomental fold, which is between your bottom lip and your chin, right, is deep, as is the cleft of her very strong chin. She has dimples on both of her cheeks. Her cheekbones and her collarbones can be seen and even felt as if they're just there beneath her skin. The physicality of this statue extends to her right hand, where you can see details of tendons, even a vein that winds its way around the ulnar styloid process on her wrist, right? That's that bump on the outside of your wrist. Ernst Langlotz acknowledged that this sculpture represents a much more physical stage in sculpture, one in which, he said, all parts of the body are more articulated and dominate the overall impression. Other korē have features that are generalized, abstracted, and patterned, but 683's features are closer to the realities of the human body, suggesting an intentional attention to the particularities of a particular body. And notice that nothing is hidden. Her hair doesn't screen her collarbones. No bracelets conceal her wrists. Her clothing not only doesn't hide her body, but it actually emphasizes it. That low kolpos, or that fold at the front, it's visible all the way around the body, but it hangs longer on the sides and front to accentuate the apparent disproportion between her torso and legs. But at the back, it's pulled up high over her buttocks to add bulk to the top, contributing to the impression of its thickness, while also making sure that everything is on full display. The point here is in the emphasis. In addition to the level of detail in the shaping of the body, the painting was also very fine and detailed. You can see that if we use some filters, that there's this decorative lotus and palmette design running along a ribbon that covers the seam of her sleeves. The paint doesn't survive, but its shadow does. We can see from the remnants of paint that the whole thing was brightly painted. With the high quality of marble, the exacting work of the artists, and the detailed painted work and polish, we can see this was a lavish dedication. Adding to the richness of the representation is her costume, which is very different from that worn by other korē and communicates that the maiden, or at least her family, had access to additional wealth in the form of luxury imports. These shoes have a distinctive pointed and upturned toe. Here you can see details of the scalloped collar or top line of the shoe, which sits below the ankle. So you can also see that her chiton on the outside of her right leg is actually hemmed up to reveal that detail, which is both incised and painted. Early scholars mentioned that the shoes also had blue shoelaces and blue outsoles, but that paint is no longer visible. Now, closed-toed shoes are rare among korē. The choice to include such distinctive and highly visible bright red footwear is significant. This style of footwear may have originated in Anatolia, right? But the Anatolian version is a boot style with very high sides, and it's worn almost exclusively by male figures. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, though, so about 50 years before this sculpture was made, the pointed toe red shoe was imported to Etruria, where the style expanded to include both boot and shoe varieties, and it became associated with both male and female figures. On this famous sarcophagus of the spouses, for example, you can see that the female figure is wearing the boot form of this shoe. In this tomb painting from Tarquinia, we get closer to the shoe form. The fact that 683 is a female figure and wearing the shoe form of this red pointed toe footwear suggests that the style came not from Anatolia, but from Etruria, from the Etruscans. The Etruscan reference here is also supported by the type of chiton that she wears. Now, the Greek chiton of the Archaic period was constructed by forming a wide cylinder of fabric, which was then flattened and buttoned along the top edge, leaving space at the center for the head and at either side for the arms. This method resulted in sleeves with these distinctive gaps between the buttons, which allowed the skin of the arm to show through. Now, the majority of Greek sculptural and painted depictions of chitons show these buttoned sleeves, with those gaps along the sleeves, as you can see here. But the Etruscan chiton is often sewn along the sleeves, not buttoned. You can see that on this late 6th century BCE Etruscan figurine, roughly contemporary with our korē. She's wearing the same style of chiton, here overlaid with a himation, and you can see the stitch marks along the seam. In some tomb paintings, you can see a decorative ribbon overlaying this seam. This figurine, by the way, is also wearing pointed footwear, here in the boot style. So the chiton being worn by 683 is not Greek, but Etruscan. It's sewn with an embroidered ribbon overlaying the seam. Her shoes are similarly foreign and also point to Etruria. This is then a conspicuous attempt by the dedicator to communicate access to luxury imported clothing from abroad, in this case from Etruria, which in the late 6th century BCE was very wealthy and influential in the Mediterranean. With the details of the body and clothes, we can make a strong argument here for intentionality in the individualized features. But we can actually say even more about this korē than that she represented a dwarf and that her costume communicated access to luxury imports from Etruria. Anthony Raubacek connected this korē with an inscribed base that reads, "Lysias dedicated this to Athena as a first fruits. Euarchus dedicated this as a tithe to Athena." Here we have a joint dedication, but one in which each person has their own verb of dedication, meaning that they each made their own dedication individually, but together as part of a single dedicatory event. This explains why the base has cuttings for 2 sculptures, one for each dedicant. We only have a fragment of that second figure that was placed on the base. We can't say much about it except that it's a female figure and appears to be wearing the same style of closed-toe pointed shoes. Now, Raubacek assumed that this was a dedication by 2 men. I won't get into the weeds here. We can in the Q&A if you'd like to. But based on a survey of male and female names in ancient Greece, I am confident that Lysias here is a man's name and Euarchus is a woman's name. So we here have a dedication by a man and a woman who dedicated together. Based on what else we see from joint dedications on the Acropolis, we can assume that these 2 dedicators were a married couple, and that each one made a dedication, which is cool because it suggests that they each had their own property from which to draw funds for a dedication. Given what else we see on the Acropolis at this time, we can also assume that they made this dedication on behalf of their family, In this case, probably their 2 daughters. Now, nearly every aspect of this proposed reconstruction is otherwise attested on the Acropolis in the Archaic period. The possibility of a married couple dedicating together, a dedication by a woman, a parent or parents dedicating statues on behalf of their children. None of this is controversial, right? It's rare. Other korē do wear closed-toed shoes. The only unattested element is dwarfism. And this is not rendered impossible or even unlikely by any available evidence from the Acropolis or elsewhere. In fact, we have other evidence that suggests that there may have been a tradition, not a rule, for some statues to reflect the bodily proportions of a living person. In the first half of the 6th century BCE, so 50 to 75 years before this statue, a man named Cleombrotus dedicated a statue to Athena in honor of his victory at Olympia. The statue doesn't survive, but its plaque does, which was dedicated with it. And it tells us that the statue is equal in size and thickness to Cleombrotus himself. Kathy Kiesling has convincingly argued that the situation implied here is that Cleombrotus dedicated a statue of himself, not of Athena, and that its size and thickness were similar to those of Cleombrotus's own body. In the 4th century BCE, a woman from Paros named Crino dedicated a statue to Artemis on the island of Delos. And the inscription tells us that she dedicated a statue equal in size to herself. Plato, the philosopher, described an oath that the 9 archons of Athens took, promising to dedicate a golden statue equal in size to themselves to Apollo at Delphi if they transgressed the laws. Leslie Kirk understood this to mean that the archons dedicated life-size statues of themselves, not of Apollo, although other scholars have suggested that they were statues of Apollo that were the same size as the archon who made the dedication. Now, whether or not any of these life-size statues were portraits in the way that we think about a portrait, at the very least, these examples indicate that there was a notion that statues could bear a direct relationship to the bodies of the person who dedicated them or who was represented. In the case of our korē, this is not a life-size statue. It's probably at 2/3 scale, which is a popular scale for this type of statue, but it still retained the proportions of a dwarf woman. Now, this argument that 683 represents a dwarf is bolstered, I think, when we look at the difficulties that scholars have had trying to fit her in to a traditional narrative of human representation in Greek art. Now, Acropolis 683, don't get ahead of me here. All right. Acropolis 683 was found on the Acropolis in 1882, before there was any major interest in korē, and at a time when there weren't many others available for comparison. In the first publication of this statue in 1883, K.D. Milonas suggested that she represented Aphrodite because of the pigeon in her arm. But as more korē were found and published, art historians began to notice how 683 was different from the other ones. People pointed out her shoes, since most other korē wear sandals. They remarked at her lack of jewelry and about how her hair doesn't fall in braids down the front of her shoulders and chest. One early scholar said she's really more strange than beautiful, and attributed her odd appearance to middling talent by the sculptor. Someone called her, this is the first quote, a disarming little creature that was created by a sculptor who, whatever his other successes may have been, was not at home making korē. One scholar suggested that she had an African air about her, and another said that her naturalistic appearance was intended to represent a, quote, negress. Some scholars actually looked to see if there was a darker pigment added to the surface of her face. Another identified her as a maidservant, citing her dark complexion and her dwarfish figure. For some scholars, she just generally lacked elegance and delicacy of workmanship. One scholar suggested that the dominant note was awkwardness combined with mediocrity, saying that she is ill at ease in her chiton and as embarrassed by the bird in her left hand as by the folds of clothing in her right. Guys, it's not over. Yet another scholar said that her appearance suggested that the scholar had a definite type in mind, one of those fast-maturing girls of Southern stock, who develop adult forms before they've grown to full height. Now, this is not just my critique of caste scholarship, because already in the 1930s, Christos Carouzos was calling for her rehabilitation, right? He said that it was unfortunate that this sculpture had been found where and when it was. Quote, at a time when archaeological criticism, in its impressionistic arrogance, ignored objectivity and concerned itself only with what suited its own taste, end quote. Nevertheless, even Carouzos offered excuses for her appearance, suggesting that she was the work of a Peloponnesian artist who was trained to produce bronzes and whose skill just didn't transfer well to the medium of stone. More recently, scholars have tended to be less negative about her appearance, but we still get some really unusual evaluations. In 2004, one scholar referred to that's this century, okay? One scholar referred to the lack of grace in her demeanor and said that her bulky shoes hide her feet, as if to warn the viewer that they are insufficiently attractive to permit exposure. This century, okay? This same scholar suggested that perhaps this is a representation of a dwarf, but if it is, she represents a rare moment of humor or sympathy amid the clamor of loftier visual and verbal messages for the ancient visitor on the Acropolis. Okay, it should be a little bit clear by now, right, that this sculpture has presented a significant challenge, we can say, to archaeologists and art historians beginning shortly after her discovery. Is she Aphrodite? Is she African? Is she Peloponnesian? Is she of Southern stock, right? Is she a dwarf person? Is she a joke, right? Was she created by a skilled craftsman or a clumsy one? As Carouzos said, it is unfortunate that she was found when she was. This is a coincidence that led to her comparison against a standard that was itself based on a very specific understanding of things like classical beauty and the ancient Greek ideal that came from an art historian in the 1700s. So in the 18th century, Johann Winckelmann systematized the study of ancient art by breaking it down into periods that represented its rise, peak, and decline. Winckelmann connected the flourishing of ancient art to the notion of freedom, which he situated in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE in Greece, which he further broke down into the high and beautiful periods. Within this new historicizing paradigm, we get the notion of an ideal in art. And Winckelmann pointed to this statue, known as the Apollo Belvedere, as the highest ideal of art from antiquity that has survived. This notion of the ideal has persisted in both scholarship and in more public fora. Okay, now everyone calm down. One of my favorite engagements with the notion of the ideal is Eugen Sandow, considered to be the founder of modern bodybuilding. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Sandow would visit museums, and he would study ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, and then he would develop exercises that would sculpt his body to match the bodies of the statues that he saw. As you can see, he was particularly taken by the figure of Heracles. Around 1919, he wrote Life is Movement, the Physical Reconstruction and Regeneration of the People, parentheses, a diseaseless world. It included just truly amazing photographs of Sandow in a variety of classical poses. But look, you can see how quickly Winckelmann's ideal got wrapped up in notions of physical perfection, but also in eugenics, right, with that reference to a diseaseless world. This tradition of associating ancient art with the concept of the ideal remains current. This was an exhibit at the Museum of Cycladic Art in Athens in 2021 and 2022 called Kalos, the Ultimate Beauty. This exhibit put on display the idea that beauty in the ancient world wasn't just about physical appearance, but also about that a physically perfect body reflected a kind of moral, internal perfection. Still, perfection, right? Where Winckelmann believed that the highest ideal could only be embodied by male figures. This exhibit was very diverse, and then it included both male and female figures, right? We can see the persistence of the ideal in scholarship, right? But in more subtle ways. Consider our korē, right? By itself, this statue is one of our most complete statues from the Acropolis. It preserves excellent evidence for polychromy, right, for the paint. That in and of itself is significant, and yet she is almost entirely absent from handbooks on ancient Greek sculpture. Going further, we have not just this sculpture, but also the complete inscription and a fragment of the second figure. All of them were found in the place where they were dedicated. This is the single best evidenced dedication from the Archaic Acropolis. Okay, this is it. This is our only complete dedication. Okay, and it presents a rare opportunity to take a fully contextual approach to a single dedicatory event. As is frequently emphasized, statues were intended to be understood with their inscriptions, not divorced from them. And here we can do just that with a complete painted statue, with an inscription that distinguishes between a tithe and a first fruits, with a dedication by both a man and a woman at a pivotal time in Athenian history, the late 6th century BCE. Why is this dedication not more prominent in our discussions of dedicatory practice? The fact of the matter is, the sculpture just doesn't fit into our preconceived notions of beauty, and so it raises questions that are not answerable within the context of traditional approaches to the material. But if we can separate our interpretation of this korē from a definition of the Greek ideal that was invented in the 18th century and is only true with the erasure of this very sculpture, if we can see the statue through new frameworks of meaning, right, the problems that this korē has presented are easily resolved. Right? According to my proposed reconstruction, a married couple named Lysias and Euarchus each dedicated a statue to Athena on the Acropolis at the end of the 6th century BCE. The statues were probably intended as stand-ins for the couple's daughters, who are not named in the inscription. One statue, Acropolis korē 683, was intentionally carved with features that are most often associated with dwarfism, presumably because one of the couple's daughters had dwarfism. She's depicted in a costume, including an Etruscan-style chiton and pointed red shoes that boasted of the family's access to luxury imports and thus to their wealth and status. Okay, you with me? Even if we accept, the first part of this argument, that the statue represents a dwarf maiden, we have some important issues that remain for us, including whether a representation or a depiction of a living individual, something like a portrait, could have been made and dedicated this early in the history of Greek art. Now, in the modern period, a portrait usually refers to an image that bears an exact, even photorealistic physiognomic likeness to its subject, right? It is important right away to relieve ourselves of that strict definition. As Sheila Dillon has argued, ancient Greek artists were largely indifferent to physiognomic likeness. Kathy Kiesling has also said that in both archaic and classical Greek portraiture, replicating the body of the individual portrait subject was seldom synonymous with creating a realistic, individualized portrait likeness. Ancient Greek portraits, even when the identification of the subject is secure, right, could have features that we would call individualized and realistic alongside features that are generic, right? This is completely okay for a sculpture. At this time, portraits serve to visually express a person's place within a larger framework based on gender, age, and social status. Now, the basic idea that an archaic statue could have been intended to represent a specific individual is not unusual if we consider the role that these statues occupied in funerary contexts. As a tomb marker, a korē or a kouros is generally accepted to represent the deceased individual, with the identification of that individual coming from the inscription, which can reflect things. The statue itself reflects things like gender, age, and status, but not really a physiognomic likeness. We can consider the Phrasikleia korē, dated to the middle of the 6th century BCE, about 50 years before our statue. This korē was a tomb marker. Its inscription tells us how to interpret it. I am the grave marker of Phrasikleia. I will be called korē forever. From the god, I obtained this name instead of marriage. So we're supposed to understand that even if we wouldn't call this a portrait in our modern definition of that word, this statue was intended to represent not a generic maiden, but Phrasikleia herself. Okay? And we can see the ways that the idea of an unexpected early death corresponds between the inscription and the iconography, as she wears a crown of unopened lotus buds and holds one in front of her. Now, in non-funerary contexts, the situation is a bit more ambiguous. For statues that were dedicated on the Acropolis, like ours, in the late 6th and early 5th century BCE, the inscribed bases only tell us who dedicated a statue, sometimes who made the statue, sometimes on whose behalf the dedication was made, but not whom the statue represented. In some cases, we can say for sure that the statue did not represent the dedicant, right? Like when a korē was dedicated to Athena by a man. This problem of interpretation is not specific to the Acropolis. The reality is that a korē could be dedicated for a variety of purposes. In one case, we have a fisherman who dedicated a korē to Poseidon after a successful catch, right? So neither the identity of the dedicator nor the identity of the god to whom it was dedicated can necessarily explain or identify the dedicated object, right? That's not to say that nobody ever dedicated portraits of themselves at this time in the Archaic period. We have a marble statue of a seated male figure from the sanctuary of Apollo at Didyma, dated to the second quarter of the 6th century BCE. And it carries an inscription that reads, "I am Chares, son of Cleisus, ruler of Teichiusa. This statue belongs to Apollo." The thing is, there are only 3 such examples of these speaking statues, as we call them. We cannot take this as representative of archaic practice. We know that victorious athletes dedicated statues of themselves in sanctuaries at this time, but it's actually more common in the classical period, after our statue. On the Archaic Acropolis, we do have things that seem like portraits. In one instance, we have a statue of a kithara player who dedicated a statue of a kithara player that was dedicated by a kithara player, right? So we assume that it was intended to represent himself. Another prospect isn't a statue, it's this relief, the so-called Acropolis potter relief, dated to the end of the 6th century BCE. That's around the same time as our korē. The relief shows a man seated on a stool, and he's holding 2 drinking cups in his left hand. The inscription tells us that a man dedicated a tithe to Athena, and we've interpreted this as a dedication by a potter who's depicted himself holding the products from his workshop that represent the profits from which the dedication was drawn. These few examples notwithstanding, though, the overall impression is that Greeks in the 6th and the 5th centuries BCE only rarely dedicated freestanding statues representing themselves in sanctuaries. But what about people dedicating statues intended to represent other people? Kathy Kiesling, who comes up a lot, she does really great work on the Acropolis, right? She says that the sheer number of statues dedicated on the Acropolis before 480, right, makes it likely that there are some portraits among them. In addition to some of the likely contenders, like the famous Moschophoros, if you're familiar with that one, we have at least 3 statues of scribes that have been considered portraits. In one case, in Acropolis 629 on the screen, this is again contemporary with our statue, we see a male figure seated on a tall stool. He leans forward, presumably poring over documents that he once held in his hand. Now, some scholars have connected this statue, or at least one of the 3 statues of scribes, with an inscription on a column that says, "Alkimikos dedicated a statue to Athena in honor of his father, Chairion." Now, Chairion is the dedicator's father, right? He's been identified with the same person who dedicated an altar on the Acropolis some number of years earlier to commemorate his service as a treasurer of Athena. So it's been proposed that there's this elite man named Chairion. He was a treasurer to Athena, and then his son made a dedication in his honor, showing someone performing his duties as the treasurer, right? In fact, statues of figures performing specific roles, like those scribes, maybe also the horsemen, these are our likeliest candidates for portraits on the Acropolis because of how specific the representations are. The fact of the matter is, from the Acropolis, we have more than 70 korē, 70 of these statues, and more than 300 inscribed stone bases, many of which would have held korē. Few of the korē can be connected with an inscribed base, meaning that in most cases, we have at best only half of the original dedication, often less given the fragmentary nature of many statues and inscriptions. We have to understand that there was no template, there was no rule for dedication in the Archaic period or really at any time. So every time we have an unambiguous attestation of a dedicatory practice or a situation, right, that then introduces the possibility for the interpretation of other more ambiguous examples. In the case of our korē, nothing that I have suggested is ruled out. And in fact, each aspect of this reconstruction is more likely than the alternatives. No aspect of it is controversial in the world of art historical scholarship if you remove the question of dwarfism. Now, what is a korē? A korē dedicated in an ancient Greek religious sanctuary was an agalma, an object endowed with the quality of being pleasing or capable of eliciting pleasure from the god or goddess to whom it was dedicated, regardless of whom any of the korē represented. They were dedicated in an attempt to delight Athena as part of a ritual exchange and simultaneously to express the family's performance of their wealth and status and even a kind of elite maidenhood. Because it was set up, our korē was successful in performing that role, okay, in pleasing Athena. Now, some people might still be skeptical that a statue intended to delight a goddess would not erase disability. Disability is often read as specific and ideologically loaded. Its mere presence must mean something, whereas non-disabled traits, like those seen on other archaic korē, are allowed to be generic, neutral, and passive. As Rosemary Garland Thompson has explained, by its very presence, the exceptional body seems to compel explanation. Now, we resist representations of disability in ancient art until we know what made it allowable. This statue was set up in a solemn context, a religious sanctuary. But dwarfism is only considered allowable in the realm of comedy or parody. This is why, for example, one scholar says that if the korē represents a dwarf, it was a joke, because that is the only possible interpretation for a dwarf in ancient Greek art. In his book on the origins of visual humor in Greek vase painting, Alexander Mitchell argues that dwarfs lent their distinctive traits to the genre of caricature to amuse the greater public and reaffirm the canon, almost pay homage to the ruling imagery. But this view is circular, okay? Dwarfs only exist in the realm of comedy or parody, and so are only identified in scenes that are obviously comedic or parodic. If a dwarf is securely identified, then that scene must be comic or parodic, regardless of any other elements in the scene, okay? Look at this scene on the Francois vase, which dates to the second quarter of the 6th century BCE. That's about 50 years before our korē. Now, all the scenes on this vase, right, there's something like 232 human figures on this vase, okay? All of the scenes on this vase are Homeric, right? And they are heroic. No obvious signs of humor anywhere on this vase. Now, at the foot of the vase is a scene of the Geranomachy, a mythical battle between the pygmies and the cranes, a battle that opens up Book 3 of the Iliad, as you can see here. Right? Homer says, now when the men of both sides, that's the Trojans and the Greeks, right? When the men of both sides were set in order by their leaders, the Trojans came on with clamor and shouting, like wildfowl. As when, right, we go one of our famous sort of comparisons, one of our allegories, right? As when the clamor of cranes goes high to the heavens, when the cranes escape the wintertime and the rains unceasing and clamorously wing their way to the streaming ocean, bringing to the Pygmaean men bloodshed and destruction. At daybreak, they bring on the baleful battle against them, right? This is our only textual attestation at this time, right, of the Geranomachy. You can see that quoted here, right? This is not comic, right? This is just a comparison of the din of battle in Book 3 of the Iliad. There are no obvious signs of caricature, comedy, or parody in the scene or indeed on the vase, right? Yet the depiction is often read as a form of comic relief, simply because the scene includes people with extraordinary bodies, right? Is this a necessary reading? Now, extraordinary bodies are hypervisible, right? But as Garland Thompson has said, the cultural resonances accorded to extraordinary bodies arise from the historical and intellectual moments in which these bodies are embedded. To put it as Robert Bogdan does, how we view people who are different has less to do with what they are physiologically than who they are culturally. For the last few centuries, dwarf people have been sought after for purposes of entertainment, and dwarfism has been construed as humorous. This has led to the assumption that there is something inherently funny about dwarfism, and that dwarfism can never be anything else. But as Aaron Pritchard has pointed out, societies have not always laughed at dwarfs. Like so much else about human behavior, what's funny is culturally specific. Nevertheless, in ancient Mediterranean studies, dwarfs and other people with extraordinary bodies have undergone a process similar to what David Hevy has called infrequent, whereby bodily eccentricities are foregrounded and simultaneously collapsed, such that all physical differences constitute a freakery. This is an amorphous category of corporeal otherness. We assume that everyone with extraordinary bodies in the ancient world were not only firmly outside of the ideal, but that they were always already infreaked. Without a critically informed framework of meaning, we constrain the narrative to one where this representation of a dwarf korē in a solemn religious context is impossible. We cannot see a dwarf person here on the Acropolis in the late 6th century BCE because we assume that dwarfism is not and was never beautiful. But this is a Greek ideal that was invented in the 18th century, an ideal that was created when few pieces of ancient sculpture were available for autopsy, an ideal that should have been revised as more evidence came to light through excavations. Instead of reconciling this seeming conflict by reconsidering ancient Greek concepts of beauty or reverence or however we want to read the korē, instead of doing that, we simply leave this entire dedication out of our narratives, despite the sheer amount of information that we can glean from it about dedicatory practices, sculptural representation, notions of the body and identity, trade and interactions with Etruria, wealth and display, citizenship and belonging, and disability in ancient Greece. The fact of the matter is, whatever else the korē represent, they were intended to delight the goddess, and we must assume that those that were set up were successful in their goals. This means then that this statue of a dwarf maiden delighted Athena. And because it was set up on the Acropolis, we can be sure that while we may try to erase her from our narratives of Greek art, this is not the same choice that the ancient Greeks made. Right? Thank you.
Well, is it okay if we open the floor?
I would
for
love
discussion and questions.
Discussion and questions.
You could, just let you call on.
Sure. Michael.
That thought that passed through my mind, what passed into my mind and stuck, is that it's not only the representation of her clothing which calls distinction to her, but it could be that the distinction is supposed to be in the artist rendering performed that way. And what I mean by that is that there's an argument, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which I think has considerable merit, and is that you have a broad class of Athenians and people in other Greek polities who can invest in this sort of thing. And this is a public monument too. And they are asking the sculptor to give it some distinction, right? That to test the limits of the form, or the type, if you will, of korē. So, and call attention to themselves as distinctly different in their, whatever the dedication is they set up. What I'm getting at is that it's not just what she's depicted as wearing, it's the fact that they are asking the artist show their daughter with the features of dwarfism. That representation in itself gives our monument distinction.
Yes.
Yeah. And to add to that, I mean, this is, the argument is bolstered by the fact that, like in the Forsythia korē, you have a little advertisement on the side, our esteem of Paros made me.
Yeah.
Right? I can do something like this. And I think that puts it properly in a social context.
Yeah, I think that that's right.
But what they were seeking for distinction, if not also beauty, and it's a public monument, so when people are going to see it, go, that's a unique example of one of those.
Yeah, I wonder about that with uniqueness, because it's not something that I don't know that much about the Greeks' relationship with uniqueness. I mean, I know we talk about individuality, right? And Greeks have more of a collectivist sense of things, right? It's not so much about standing out as much as it's being like the best among the things that are already there.
But you know the argument I'm talking about, where a lot of the development is attributed to artists vying with each other.
Definitely.
One another.
And I think one of the things that I hope comes out of this, right, is a kind of re-engagement with this idea of not looking at the korē as a collective group, but actually reassessing them individually to see what they tell us, right? And this is just one of the things about disability is that, a lot of things don't stand out to us as a sort of non-disabled majority, right? Things only become visible when there's some sort of a conflict with our expectations, right? And a lot of that happens in the confrontation with disability, right? But this gives us an opportunity then, right, to apply some of these lessons about thinking about things like distinctiveness to the other ones that we might have overlooked because we consider them generic.
Right. But this is, I guess, this kind of distinction that they were seeking. And I think I'm trying to contextualize it, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think we could definitely talk about motives and intention here. I mean, I think that this was all very intentional, and so how this works. We still don't know a lot about the relationship between a dedicator and a sculptor, and where how those kinds of conversations went. But I do think that with this, we can talk a little bit more about that, about the agency of the people making the dedication and the choices that show up in the statues. I think that's yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I was curious if where the statue was found on, dedicated on the Acropolis, and if that location in relevance to the other korē had any relevance.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, okay, so a little bit of history. Sorry about this. Okay, so in the early 5th century BCE, so after the statue was set up, the Persians sacked the city of Athens, and they destroyed a bunch of stuff. And it kind of stayed there for a little bit, but eventually they buried it all on the Acropolis, right? We often call these the Persian destruction pits. There's a German word for it if you're interested. So we have these pits that are just filled with statues and other kinds of things that we think were probably destroyed during the Persian invasion of Athens. And this was found in one of those pits. And we have a couple of them. And there's a lot of discussion about what is the relationship between the location of these pits and the location of the statues when they were set up. There's some really interesting work. I think there's this really interesting master's dissertation, if you're interested in this, sort of cataloging these different pits and what's in them. The one that this one was in, most of the statues were smaller. There's another pit that has most of the bigger ones. And so maybe there's a size-related thing. But she was found on the Acropolis in one of these Persian destruction pits. I think kind of near the Parthenon. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where she was set up. Actually, though, her buttocks, this portion right there, that was actually found in the Athenian Agora, just to the north. Yeah, so you can imagine a situation, right, where you've cleaned up, right? You've swept everything, you've buried it in your nice pits, and then you've got that one last dustpan, and you're like, oh, I already took out the trash, though, so you just kind of toss it over the edge. Right, is how I imagine it, is with a dustpan. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for such a rich talk. I'm curious about if you could talk a little bit more about putting this within the frame of disability, right?
Sure.
Because I really see the frame of the ideal and the beauty and the non-normative, but why automatically is non-normative disabled, I guess is one thing to think about. And, well, I have so many other questions, but I'll leave them.
Yeah, so we have a little bit of an issue here when it comes to what you label as disability, right? So this is a current debate that people have, is about who uses that label and who doesn't. This is a particularly big discussion in the dwarfism community, right, about whether they identify as some do and some don't, right? For me, it's more about taking that lens of disability, right, that perspective, and looking at this as an extraordinary body, to use a phrase that Rosemary Garland Thompson uses, and to look at people with conditions that we would identify as disability, right, and to see how they're living in the ancient world and about the limits of it, right? So actually, a large part of my work is explaining that these are in fact not non-normative in the ancient world, but in putting it in the context of modern disability, we have a conversation that we can open about what we consider normative, right? When we take a look at, people tend to have this kind of innate sense. It feels innate. It feels natural, right, that we would categorize people in certain ways, right? But the thing about disability is that it kind of doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist in some idealized way, some sort of abstract way, right? It applies in different contexts, right? Disability arises with the expectations of what a body should be able to do in any specific context, and then disabled people are people who cannot fulfill those expectations, whatever they are, right, for that society. And so one of the things I tried to do with my work, and this one will be one of them, right, is to demonstrate that we draw different lines, right? And that's important because once you recognize that you can draw different lines, that different people have drawn different lines, then we recognize that it's a choice, right? And when you look at different approaches to these choices, you recognize that there is room to make a different choice, right? And so that's kind of where my work sits in this, is by taking a disability lens, using disability studies, critical disability theory, right, and those things, looking at the ancient world, I don't do a lot of this kind of diagnostic work, but trying to understand where are disabled people, what are they doing, are they meeting the expectations of other people who are the same age, gender, status, et cetera, and when they can't, right, so sometimes it just isn't going to work out, what happens, right, in those situations? So if you look at labor and employment, for example, right, so citizen men are expected to, have some sort of employment by which they support, right, their families, whatever that looks like. Okay, we were talking about this at lunch, there is a pension in Athens for disabled citizens, right? And we have a few sources that discuss this. And the pension is interesting because the wording of it is that, first there's a property qualification, but also you have to be so disabled that you're unable to work, which has two kinds of implications here. Number one, you can be disabled and work, right? Which is huge, right? Because it means that just because you have something that we would identify as a physical disability doesn't mean that you're unable to participate economically, whatever that means. But also that there is an understanding that impairment effects are real, right? That sometimes your impairment is going to prevent you from doing something, right, that you were otherwise expected to do. And just that recognition is really important to me, that they understand the embodied nature of disability and the limits without creating necessarily a second-class situation with it. This isn't about saying that the ancient world was this utopia for disabled people. It's about saying that they made different choices, and when you recognize that, maybe we could recognize that we could make different choices. Yes?
Thanks, Debbie. That was great. I was wondering, I know that not much is preserved, but about the second figure, what we can say about it at all. It looks like it's a smaller figure, so a younger sister maybe. And it's a little bit hard to tell from the photographs, but is that figure wearing shoes or sandals, or can we say anything about similarities?
There are a few things that we can say. Let me take this off. Okay, so there are a few things that we can say. First of all, we can tell it is a female figure. She's wearing a garment, and specifically, let me see if I can find it. This dangly bit here, right, is something that's held in to hold the garment down so that you don't have a Marilyn Monroe situation, okay? But this is chipped at the toes, right? But we think that this is that same kind of shoe, right? Here's my, okay, I don't think this is in the article. I don't remember. Here's my theory, okay, is that the size of them doesn't necessarily correlate to anything. It could. I don't really know. But what we have is we have a man and a woman making a dedication. They each have a verb of dedication, which means that they didn't jointly dedicate one thing. They each made a dedication, which means they each have property from which to make a dedication, okay, which is huge because that means a woman has some sort of property, probably her dowry, but fine. Okay, so by my theory, I mean Andy Stewart's theory. That okay, I should be really clear about this. Is that Lysias, the male figure, has just more property, right? And so he has more money, and so his first fruits dedication, which we also think is a larger percentage, is going to be the more expensive statue. So it's a better quality of marble, it's a better sculpting, right? More detail, better polish, better things like that. And that the smaller one is a coarser grained marble and has less detail and probably is a result of a sort of lower value monetarily dedication. Yeah. Yes?
Earlier you mentioned about proportions that there was standard representation of dwarfism in art. Is that standard from contemporary art in ancient Greece, or is it from all art in the Western world?
It's a great question. It's specific to Greece, right? So archaic and mostly classical period, early classical maybe. There are different conventions, right? So there are certain aspects of dwarfism that show up in Egyptian art that don't show up in Greek art. And there's a really interesting book. I mean, it could use some more theory, but it's by Veronika Dassen it's a sort of comparison of dwarfs in ancient Egypt and Greece. Anyway, so these are just features that they don't always show up all of them all together, but in some combination is what communicates dwarfism. Right, dwarfism is really hard to identify in art. This is why I don't generally do this, is because it's a little bit difficult, because sometimes short stature means status, right? So enslaved people are sometimes shown at a smaller scale than citizens, right? So short stature by itself might not mean anything. A disproportionately large head by itself, right, is also used to indicate children at certain periods of art. That deeply swayed back can be used to depict athletes, right, especially younger athletes. And so by themselves, none of these features, right, are meaningful, but it's in their combination and in the context in which they show up. Yeah. Yes?
Could you speak on, like, maybe more depictions of disability and whether any of them, besides this one, were all for comedic purposes? Particularly, I'm wondering about Hephaestus, because he's a god, and they still poke fun of his disability, like,
Yeah.
in the mythology. So.
Yeah, this is a great question. This is about other representations of disability. One of the things that, so most of the, if you're doing your research as a student, right, most of the representations of disability that you'll see are described as comedic. And then there are other depictions of disability that I don't think are identified as disability because they're not funny, right? So this one people have struggled with because they're like, it's dwarfism, so it's funny, but it's on the Acropolis, so it can't be funny, but it has to be funny, but it can't be funny, right? And so that's why people are like, let's just not talk about it, okay? Let's just put her somewhere else, right?
Kill the normal her.
Yes. And so, we just kind of write them out. And so one of the things, right, is I don't think that we need to just go through art and be like, who's disabled, right? And just like point them out. That's not the point, right? But it is to open ourselves up to the understanding that, Greek art isn't just depicting like one type of person, and also that Greeks were not like statues come to life, right? It turns out Greeks had human bodies. You heard it here first, okay? Greeks had human bodies, and sometimes those bodies show up in art. And so there are a lot of really other great depictions of disability, and I think that they deserve reanalysis in sort of a more modern context where we understand that things can look different than what we expect based on our sort of modern understanding of disability. And then in terms of depictions, Hephaestus is great, okay? I could go on forever about this guy. I won't, okay? So Hephaestus is fantastic, right? Because he's a Greek god. He's one of the 12 Olympian gods, right? And if you read about Hephaestus and his disability, people are like, oh my God, they hated him because he was disabled, right? In the Iliad and in the Odyssey, right, we get these references to Hephaestus. When he's born, his mother rejects him, throws him out of Olympus because he's disabled, right? And we're like, see, the Greeks hated it, right? Hera was also thrown out of Mount Olympus for other reasons, right? And people are like, yeah, but people like, they look at this scene where Hephaestus catches his wife Aphrodite having an affair with the god Ares, right? And he catches them and snares them in this magic net. And then he calls in the other gods to come and laugh. And they're like, they're all laughing at Hephaestus, right? The cuckold, right? They aren't, though, in the scene. They are laughing at Ares, right? It's interesting because all of the scenes, right, the same things happen to all of the gods, right? So they'll talk about Hephaestus is in this unhappy relationship because he's disabled. Guess what? Apollo, I don't think has any happy relationships, okay? Okay, and he's not disabled, and we don't then offer an explanation. This is the thing about disability having this explanatory purpose. When something happens to a disabled person, we're like, especially if it's bad, we're like, oh, that's because of the disability, right? Hephaestus is hated because he's disabled. Zeus tells Ares, I hate you more than any of the other gods, and if you weren't my son, right? And so we can talk about this. We can isolate Hephaestus if we want to, but when we put him back in his context of the other Olympian gods and the ways that they show up in myth, guess what? The things are very similar, right? We have a lot of the same things happening to Hephaestus as the other gods. It turns out they all kind of make fun of each other for various things, right? And so then what's our question about disability? So disability is offered up as an explanation, but when we remove it as being the only god who's treated this way, and just make him, he's also treated this way for these reasons, how do we work it then, right? And so it's more about putting Hephaestus back in with the rest of the Olympian gods. It's more about putting this sculpture back in with the rest of the sculptures before we can ask the question about sort of how do we do this, is we just need to reinsert it into our narratives. things. Yes.
I have a question stemming from the kind of like collection of reception quotations you had.
Okay.
Yeah, letter, no.
They're all named in the article. It's a very robust bibliography.
No, but they're, okay, first a little bit of stuff. So, very broadly, there are some similarities in kind of the way, there's this like tension between the ancient and modern understandings of disability and like racialization processes in the ancient world. And I guess one is that, like, is there actually evidence? So, like, if Debbie probably knows this, but
By the way, this is my friend Anne.
right? Like, we understand, right? Like, skin color historically is like a modern understanding of like, or thing of like, an axis of racial differentiation. It is not the primary axis in the ancient world, or at least
Right.
the Greek world. So these like modern kind of attention to skin color in Greek art, though, is something that exists because of the modern understanding of groups. Anyway, so is there actually evidence that there was like a dark like pigment on the?
No.
They just like made that up.
They just made it up. So look, first, there's this like really strong correlation, in my opinion, between how mean art historians are about a figure and the likelihood that they just represent a disabled person. What we recognize in this situation is that they hate her, and they're trying to figure out what form of ugly she is, right? And this is just scholars struggling to figure out ugly in what way. And so it actually reflects a lot of the biases in scholarship at the time of what we considered beautiful and ugly. And so when we get these racialized depictions, that is telling you that they believe that this type of representation is ugly because of the race aspect or because of the disability aspect.
Yeah. No, thank you. So then my follow-up was, is this just like, are these kind of allusions to race just something that appears in like this general genre of people being kind of condescending about this sculpture, or do you know if like she filters into any like is there scholarship on the other side where like these catalogs of kind of like Snowden or something?
No.
Do people say like, oh, this is that? Okay.
No, she doesn't show up in discussions on race, but race shows up in discussions of her. Right, yeah. Cool, yes?
So I'm wondering how or if you think this should affect the way we talk about the more generic aspects of Greek art. And you hinted at this a little bit, I think, in saying that you think the korē should be re-examined, maybe to look for more individualistic features or signs of difference. But if after re-examinations like that, there still are these features that seem more generic, how do you think we should talk about what they were trying to achieve if we don't want to just say, oh, it's idealized in the modern sense?
Yeah, so I don't, we do have a lot of generic features, including in our korē, right? Definitely a lot of generic idealized features, right? It's not necessarily about reconfiguring this idea that the maidens should be read as a group, right? That the korē should be read as a group. But for us to understand that if we want to read them as a group, whatever interpretation we come to for how we understand what they represent, is this idealized maidenhood, is this a collective sense of beauty, whatever that is, it includes disability. Right? And so it's about that and not necessarily about not viewing them as a group. I think that Greeks viewed them as a group, right? So you go up, there's a bunch of statues of maidens. I think that's pretty clear, right? That this is a bunch of statues of maidens. This is a very popular dedication type, right? Especially on the Acropolis. We have a lot of this. I think that they understand them as a type, right? With individualized features, but like as a generic type, right? That you can modify as you want. But whatever you want to say about them as a type, it does include disability. Right.
So would you want to avoid the word idealized at all, or do you think it
I don't really have an opinion on that. I don't really care. It's more just about what underlies the use of the term, right? And sort of getting people to recognize that, like, when we talk about the ideal and we talk about the Greek gods, for example, right? We're like, oh, except Hephaestus. Oh, the maidens, except 683. Actually, we did that exception. They didn't, right? The Greeks don't have to have a disabled god, right? That's not a lot. They don't have DEI, okay? Okay. It's not required. And yet, they did have one, right? And so if we remove him, if we put an asterisk on Hephaestus, that's us, not the Greeks, right? Some people will talk about Hephaestus and they'll say, right, so Hephaestus is like the father of Athenian autochthony. The Athenians went real hard on being indigenous to their land in the 5th century. And they develop a myth, right, where Hephaestus is the progenitor of the first Athenian that was born from the earth, right? I won't go into the details, okay?
We know that.
Yeah. But, okay, and you'll read sometimes, you'll be like, the Athenians had this really ambivalent relationship with Hephaestus as their progenitor, right? Except that they didn't, right? They invented it. Right? They gave him a temple in the Athenian Agora. He sits next to Athena on the Parthenon frieze. He has an altar in the main temple of Athena on the Athenian Acropolis. They're cool with it, okay? We're weird. And it's more about us confronting ourselves and our history of all of this, and just kind of reassessing them individually, but also collectively, right? And recognizing that disability is part of these things. And so when you're talking about the ideal in ancient Greek art, it can no longer be about physical perfection, right? Or how we have thought of physical perfection, to exclude what we would call disability. Yeah. Yeah, yes?
No. I was going to rip on that.
Whenever you're talking about art and you're talking about how we describe it, how we look at it, or you're also considering how they themselves write about it, because I know we have various manuscripts from that age, and also there's carving on the dedication, stuff like that. You also consider how they are writing about it, how they are speaking about it in their writing and carving and such.
Yeah, definitely. So most of the time that we get people sort of writing about art, it's Roman, right? So we get them commenting on things like that. But when we see them making references to dedications and to things like that, I'll just go through some interesting things. When we see references to things, they're not really picking out differences, right? They'll just be like, oh, these beautiful things, right? And I think that that's an important thing, is that they're not making exceptions or distinctions. They're not over-explaining it, right? We did have texts in the 5th century BCE. Polykleitos, who is a sculptor, allegedly wrote a book called Canon, right, where he talks about ideal proportions. And then we have a sculpture called the Doryphoros, the spear bearer, that we think is an illustration of it. But it's just speculation what he wrote about, right? In the sense of what the details were, right? And we think idealized proportions must mean a specific thing. Here's this statue. But we don't really know the full extent of that conversation, right? It's something that we can't really talk about. The best for this, for the Greek period, is probably the philosophical treatises of the 4th century, right? So Aristotle and Plato talk about bodies and about people. They say things like, anyway, lots of things I won't get into, but references to women and their bodies and children and their bodies, to dwarfs and their bodies, things like that. And so we start to get these discussions more starting in the 4th century and going forward, but nothing really contemporary with what I've got going on here. But it's an interesting question.
How they speak about the mythologies and stuff like that, because what people worship is also a great reflection on just how they see each other. I mean, you got to think about how they present Zeus, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, and how they represent each god.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's complicated, right? Because the gods don't behave in ways that Greeks would be allowed to behave, right?
But
yeah.
It's also a reflection of how they see each other and things they can do, things they think more powerful people can do, what they think weaker people shouldn't do. You see, and then also, and you talk about how this is also in their temples, and in their temples, the relation between how they see these peoples playing in their religion, and if they have this statue near their god, and when they see it, then they see it as people that they would let generally in their temples and probably in their general lives.
Yeah, I think that you've got some great points there about, thinking about what the implications are for representation in the general life, right? This is the kind of thing I'm interested in, is like, how can we take these representations in text and in art, and then how can we make inferences from that about what ancient life was like for disabled people, for non-disabled people, et cetera? That's an excellent point, right? About there must be some relationship between these things, and it's just a question of finding out what that relationship is, right? It's really interesting. Thank you.
I also think about the positions of where they put the art.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think you definitely could. It's just hard when we don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. It was really wonderful. I just have a couple comments, and the first one would be sometimes disability is part of the ideal, right? I don't think it's the case here, but in the case of Hephaestus, it is. It's the cost of intellectual labor that Hephaestus is going through. He's the lame smithy. The poet, Demodocus, the poet, Homer, the blind, right? And that's the cost of their abilities to sublimate and to be creative artists, whether at the technical level or at the poetic level. So, I mean, it makes perfect sense that those two individuals are represented as disabled.
Yeah, potentially. This is a sort of an idea of compensation, right? That from disability is born these creative energies. We have a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation, which is, so one of the things about disability, and I sort of toy with this with the figure of Hephaestus as a creative god, right? The thing about disability is that you kind of do have to be really creative, right? Because you live in a world that is difficult for you to navigate, right? And so you have to get really creative. And so the question is he creative because he's disabled? Is he disabled because he's creative, right? Is this a compensation thing, or do we just have a correlation, right? These are great questions that are currently unanswerable.
Yeah, and I'm not presuming to
Yeah.
talk about the causality there, but they are part and parcel of what these individuals do and are. Right?
Yeah, potentially, but I guess it's just a question of like, to what extent can we push this suggestion about compensation? Is it meaningful that they are disabled and these things, or is that because we think of it this way, right? I don't know yet. So this is a real question that I have, is about like, it's really difficult to get out of that connection, right, to see the disability as meaningful in the sense of compensation. But other gods are creative who aren't disabled, and so how do you explain poets who aren't disabled? How do you explain figures who do similar things but aren't disabled, right? So it's not 100% correlation, which is what makes this difficult.
No, but in sort of the Archaic period, and Greek culture grows out of that sort of mindset. But we'll put that aside for a moment. The second thing is what Ares undergoes and what Hephaestus undergoes, don't seem to me to be comparable, because Ares is hated. He's a scourge.
Yeah, in the Iliad.
Everybody lambastes him for what he is,
right,
not for any accidental characteristics he has. Hephaestus, on the other hand, he's cuckold, right? He doesn't get any respect. And you're right, they're not laughing at him, but it's also ridiculous for him to be in the position he's in with his wife caught naked with a naked Ares behind the invisible chains.
So
right?
I'm not sure that it is. So he calls in the audience. So I think that if this was ridiculous and embarrassing for him, he would not have called in the audience. And also, the person who's in a ridiculous position is Ares, not Hephaestus.
Being laughed at, but Hephaestus is the one who's being laughed at the end of Book 1, when he's bustling around serving wine to the gods, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny to watch him bustle around, limping on his leg, while he's trying to keep the cups of the gods filled, right?
I have a lot of questions about the role of laughter in.
Nobody laughs when he has a flamethrower.
Yeah, that's true.
But certainly when he's pouring wine for the gods. Yeah.
So the question is, why are they laughing? And there's been a lot of really interesting work on theories of laughter and about things that it does. Are they laughing at Hephaestus? Are they laughing because this is real awkward, right? Is he, because he's breaking up this argument between Zeus and Hera? And is this like a tension relief, right? I have a lot of questions about the role of laughter in Homer that I hope, please someone, study the role of laughter. Because
it's a similar figure in Book 2, where he kind of, the laughter of his humiliation reunites knights of the army that have been disintegrating.
Definitely.
And it seems to be, Hevestus seems to play a similar role there. You might disagree with that. It's
No, no,
fine.
I think
wanna
it's
put you
okay
in
if they're
third.
laughing. It's okay if they're laughing at disability. I just don't think that that's been what's proven.
Well, I don't think they're laughing at disability. They're laughing at a disabled individual in an act of.
I think it's possible. I don't think it's been proven.
Well, okay, fine. You know, these things are not provable.
Yeah.
Here, the fourth thing is the motives for dedication and who's being dedicated.
Sure.
Because you said, oh yeah, Archaic is paying with her dowry for this. It seems to me to be very unlikely. Because the dowry contract, the husband has full use value.
Sure.
Of it. So it's likely that these two individuals are in a profession where both of them are making the money.
It's possible. It requires a rethinking of the sort of economic basis of things. So women's labor, which Catherine Harrington might speak better about. Women's labor is not typically like compensated in the same ways, right? It as like I don't know about paid labor for sort of elite women, right? And they must be elite. They're dedicating on the Acropolis.
Well, they have money. It doesn't mean they're necessarily elite. And they're giving these two offerings, these two statues, as in the one case, an aparté, a first fruit, i.e. of the money that they've made.
Right.
In the other case, a more specific kind of dedication, a 1/10.
Right.
Right? Because an aparté could be any percentage.
Yeah,
Right? But a décolleté, that's a 10.
right.
Doesn't have to be exactly that, but close enough for
Yeah.
one. So the question is, they're giving, they've got some sort of windfall. They're
Yeah.
grateful for
sure.
the money that they've made. And so how did they make that money? That's the question.
Yeah,
And
this
what
is-
seems to be Aorchis is a partner in that enterprise.
Yeah,
Whatever
this
the
is why this
enterprise
part's not in the article, is because I don't know. Yeah, I don't study the archaic economy
Okay.
yet. Okay, yeah, so I don't know. Like it's this is all of the information that we have, and so it's just speculative on what exactly this.
The slippers seem to be symposium slippers, right?
They become symposium slippers in the 5th century,
Well,
and
it's-
they actually become wedding slippers.
The imagery that you were showing seemed to be symbolic. Some of it.
Yeah, that was the representation of the chitons, the garments, right? So this is just a representation of the sort of
that's
button
a
sleeve.
Yes?
Yeah, but it's not about the female figure. It's just about the garment that she wears. Because the other korē, this is not a hetaira, but she wears this similar kind of garment with the buttoned.
The last suggestion I want to make, that it is, that they are hetairae, and they were making a lot of money for those two individuals, and they're dedicating the money that they made from those sex workers in the form of the statue to Athena on the Acropolis.
Sorry, you think that the korē
Yes.
is a representation of a hetaira?
Yeah, hetaira or even a korē. Yeah. I mean, it's not a korē in the sense that the whole thing about the korē is that the enigmatic smile. You're looking at her, but she's not looking at you.
Do you think other korē are hetaira?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that that's a bigger leap than I would
Yeah,
make.
but the thing is, this isn't not represented as virgin, right? Should be.
What?
Well, I mean, look at the way she's looking at you. You know, the korē don't look at you like that. I mean, there's a sort of eidos, a sort of shame that's part of the figure, and that enigmatic smile. Okay, this is our one looking you right in the eye and very voluptuously.
I'm not sure what to do with that, but in this context, let's talk about it at dinner. Let's have some wine and loosen this up. Okay. Okay. No, it's okay. It's just
Point out the symposium scene, that's the traditional chiton, right?
Yes.
That's not the type she's wearing.
yes. Yeah, she's also not wearing that.
And if she was coded, wouldn't it be more, are medics allowed to dedicate on the Acropolis?
I'm not saying that they're necessarily medics.
I was just going to
Oh, I
say,
was
a
asking
broader
if they were.
critical lesson for our broader audience may simply be that markedness need not have a negative valence. And we should keep it in mind, bring that in mind, so.
I was gonna ask about her pet bird.
Yeah, the bird is incredible. Okay. That's okay. All right. Thank you all so much. This was fun. I'm happy to answer more questions over some crudité.
Yeah, before everybody leaves, and please do avail yourselves of the reception. I'm going to invite you on October 23rd at 6 p.m. in a much finer space than this, to attend the Harlem State of Mind featuring the UMBC Jazz Ensemble and a panel of UMBC faculty discussing the enduring Harlem Marathon. So enjoy yourselves and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
That was okay.
That was really fun. I don't know what this does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty common.
I was like, I remember the growl wrong, but also like,
Yeah. No, birds are
not my,
totally great.
not my